Terra's Fury by J.B. Crow.
Chapter 1. The War We Never Saw Coming. There was never peace, only a fragile calm waiting to shatter. Now war is here, not a war of armies or nations, but something far greater, a fight for survival itself. We should have seen it coming. The signs were there, plain as day, but we were too distracted, too sure of ourselves. We thought we were safe. We thought we had time. We were wrong. The world began to crack years ago, slowly, quietly, and the storms grew louder. The ground shifted beneath us. The air thickened without warning. We told ourselves it would pass, that things would get better. They didn't. And now here we are, standing on the edge. But this isn't the end, not yet, because we are still here, bruised, broken, but breathing. And as long as we breathe, we fight. For every inch, every second, every chance to turn this back. This war won't be won with weapons, it will be won with will and determination, with the stubborn, reckless refusal to give in. We may have been fools once, but not now. Not anymore. It started years ago, slowly unraveling. But this is where we draw the line. We fight now, or we lose everything. The ground shouldn't breathe, but it did. A slow, steady pulse beneath the Earth's crust. Barely detectable, unless you knew where to look. And it was my job to look. I'm Eric Lawson, Chief Geologist and Seismologist at the Institute for Earth Preservation, and right now the Earth was sending signals I didn't want to understand. Jason Parker, our director, always knew how to spot the smallest shift, the faintest anomaly. But this time, even he looked unsettled. The seismic readings flickered on the monitor, a subtle 0.39 variance, small enough to dismiss, big enough to make Jason pace like a caged animal behind me. It's nothing, I muttered, but deep down I knew better. The Earth was waking up. Eric! Jason's voice cracked through the air, sharp and tense. I jolted. Yeah? Look at panel D9. I leaned in, my eyes locking onto the data. A cold sweat crept down my neck. 0.39 variance, I said quietly. Jason's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming impatiently on the console. It's rising slowly, like it's breathing. Before I could respond, the conference room doors hissed open. Jason's posture stiffened. We're in the middle of something, Director. A tall man in a press suit strode in, an assistant trailing behind him. Government officials carried an air of authority, imposing, calculated, and never here without reason. I can see that, Mr. Parker, the man said coolly. But the Department of Environmental Security doesn't wait. The Secretary wants answers, and I want to know more about this place and what you do. Jason's glare could have melted steel. I cleared my throat, stepping in to break the tension. Director Harris, right? I'm Eric Lawson, Chief Geologist and Seismologist. You wanted to understand what we do. Well, here we are. Jason gave me a curt nod. Handle it. The Institute for Earth Preservation was built to detect, analyze, and prevent environmental catastrophes, I began. We're not just scientists. We're the safety net when the planet turns hostile. I gestured to the team. Alana Rupal, meteorologist and climatologist. If the atmosphere even thinks about shifting, she's on it. That storm over the Pacific formed in hours. Shouldn't be possible, but Alana's tracking it. Alana didn't look up. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, eyes sharp behind dark-rimmed glasses. Impossible isn't in the forecast anymore, she muttered. Daniel Reed, our ecologist. I tilted my head toward him. Daniel sat hunched in his chair, biting the corner of his thumb, eyes darting between screens filled with migration maps and vegetation models. If ecosystems start collapsing, we'll feel it before we see it, he mumbled, more to himself than anyone else. Daniel sees the cracks before they spread, I added. Jason's eyes flicked to Daniel, lingering for a second too long. He trusted Daniel's instincts, even if Daniel barely trusted his own. Sean Crow, oceanographer. The oceans are shifting in ways we can't explain. If something's off in the currents, Sean's already drowning in the data. Sean leaned back, arms crossed, a half-empty coffee cup perched on the console. The Atlantic's running cold where it should be warm. Currents are slowing. Something's choking the system, but I'm not sure what yet. And Stephen Wu, marine biologist, he watches the life beneath the waves, mass die-offs, coral bleaching, predator migrations. The oceans are our early warning system, and Stephen reads them like a book. Stephen leaned forward slightly, all humor gone. And Jason Parker, I finished, facing Director Harris. Our director, Earth scientist. I hesitated for a moment, choosing my words carefully. Calling Jason a jack of all trades would be wrong. He's more than that. He's the reason any of us are here. His knowledge cuts across every discipline. Geology, climatology, oceanography, ecology. You name it. Jason knows it. And not just surface-level knowledge. The kind that makes the rest of us wonder how the hell he found the time to learn it all. Jason remained silent, eyes locked on the data as if the world outside the monitors didn't exist. Yeah, he gets under our skin with how obsessively he chases details. I continued, voice softer now. But that's why the Institute for Earth Preservation exists. He built this team, this whole operation, because he saw what no one else did, that the planet isn't just breaking down in pieces. It's unraveling, and Jason Parker is the only one who can see the full picture. Jason finally looked up, his gaze steady and sharp. And what exactly is coming? Director Harris asked, folding his arms. Jason's voice was low but unwavering. A chain reaction. Earth, sea, sky. They're all shifting. It's all connected and it's accelerating, faster than we thought. Alana's voice was quiet but steady. Storms like this don't just appear. The atmosphere is being forced into patterns we don't understand. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. And species are moving like they know something we don't. Migration routes are off. Pollination cycles are breaking. Sean let out a slow breath. And the oceans, wrong. Currents slowing, oxygen levels dropping. It's all out of rhythm. Jason leaned forward slightly, fixing Harris with a hard stare. The planet's changing, and if we don't figure out why, it's going to erase us. Director Harris exhaled slowly, casting a glance over the team. I'll inform the secretary, but if this spirals out of control, we'll need solutions, not theories. Jason didn't flinch. Then stay out of our way. We have work to do. Harris gave a tight nod and turned on his heel, the doors sliding shut behind him. The room settled into a heavy silence. Jason broke it. Alana, keep tracking that system. Sean and Stephen, focus on oceanic shifts. Daniel, any signs of ecosystem collapse? I want to know immediately. Eric, stay on the seismic data. No distractions. We moved without another word. The Earth was shifting beneath us, and we were the only ones standing in its way. Across the room, Alana leaned in close to her monitors, eyes darting between weather models and atmospheric data. A half-finished cup of coffee sat cold beside her keyboard, forgotten. She barely blinked as new storm patterns flickered across the screens. Alana, I called over, keeping my voice steady. Yes, Jason, Alana replied. Do you see anything unusual on your end? Jason continued. She didn't look up. There's a low-pressure system forming faster than normal over the Pacific. It's erratic, unstable, but nothing I can't explain. Yet. That was Alana, completely locked in, practically fused to her monitors. I once joked she'd probably notice a cloud blinking out of existence before realizing someone was talking to her. She didn't laugh. Jason's pacing quickened. Keep an eye on it, he said sharply, but Alana was already 10 steps ahead. The rest of the day passed like any other. We kept monitoring the data, tracking the usual patterns. Seismic waves, atmospheric disturbances, rising temperatures. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about what Jason had said. The days that followed were tense, every monitor glowing with silent warnings. Then it happened. Mount Cinnabung exploded. The eruption tore through the sky with a violence no one could have predicted. Villages vanished beneath ash. The sky turned black. We stared at the incoming reports in stunned silence. No warning, I whispered, scanning the seismic data. Nothing this massive should have gone unnoticed. Jason's face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. It's starting! And it didn't stop there. Floods in Brazil, wildfires in California, tornadoes in Kansas. One after another, nature turned violent. Jason slammed a map onto the table. Layers of seismic data sprawled across it. He hesitated for a moment before pulling up overlays of deforestation zones and mining sites, frowning as he searched for a pattern. These areas, there's some overlap, but it could be coincidence, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The connection wasn't clear yet, just a troubling possibility hanging in the air. It's all connected, he growled. The Earth isn't just reacting, it's retaliating. I stared at the patterns. The disasters seemed too frequent to be purely random. Patterns emerged, but they were faint, barely enough to suggest a connection to humanity's environmental damage. Still, it was too soon to be certain. My throat tightened. You're saying the Earth is what? Fighting back? Jason met my eyes, hesitation flickering across his face. I think it's warning us, but I can't be sure. We might be running out of time. The ground trembled beneath us, a subtle, deliberate pulse. The war was beginning. Look at this, he said, pulling up a map that overlaid seismic activity with deforestation data, coal mines, and other environmental destruction. I watched as he zoomed in on Sumatra, the region where the volcano had erupted. What am I looking at? The eruption didn't happen in a random location. It happened right where the damage is the worst. The heart of Sumatra's deforestation zones, the coal mines, the palm oil plantations, the illegal logging operations. I frowned, trying to follow his reasoning. So you're saying it wasn't just a random eruption? The volcano chose that spot. Jason's voice was urgent, filled with the conviction I had come to expect from him when he had a theory to prove. It's not about choosing, it is about responding, like a system reacting to stress. I shook my head, skeptical. You're saying the Earth is fighting back? Jason turned to look at me, his face grim. I think it's trying to tell us something. It's not just the volcano. It's the floods in Brazil, the fires in California, the tornadoes in Kansas. All of them are hitting the places we've damaged the most. I was quiet for a moment, processing his words. It seemed absurd, a leap too far. Nature didn't think. It didn't have a mind, a plan. It was chaotic, unpredictable. But the evidence was beginning to pile up. Could the Earth really be responding to what we have done to it? Maybe it's not personal, I said, still trying to rationalize. Maybe it's just nature, reacting to human interference. Jason looked at me, his expression pained. Maybe, but what if it is more than that? Alana, our environmental analyst, walked over, having heard the last part of our conversation. She was skeptical too, but there was a growing sense of concern in her voice. Look at the patterns, she said, pointing to the maps. Look at the overlap. Disasters aren't random. They're centered around the areas we've exploited. It's like the Earth is targeting the places where we've caused the most harm. And that was when it hit me. Maybe Jason wasn't just being paranoid. Maybe he was right. Chapter 2. The First Clues. 2 weeks passed after the eruption of Mount Cinnabung, and I could not shake the feeling that something was building. A quiet tension beneath the surface of daily life. The days were punctuated by the usual reports: escalating seismic activity, unusual weather patterns. But there was something different now. The world was starting to change. It began as a ripple, a subtle shift in how we viewed the planet. People had always seen the Earth as something to conquer, something to tame. But now there was an uncomfortable feeling that we had pushed it too far, that it had crossed some invisible line. The IEP lab buzzed with activity, but it wasn't the normal hum of routine monitoring. There was an urgency in the air. Alana's fingers flew over her keyboard as she pulled up satellite images from the Amazon, her brow furrowed in concentration. Eric, our geologist, studied seismic maps, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. Even Sean, who usually oversaw the ocean data, seemed on edge as he watched the changing currents and rising sea levels. Jason had become increasingly distant, obsessed with a theory that I wasn't sure I believed. He would pace the lab for hours, his thoughts constantly racing. He couldn't let go of the idea that the Earth was fighting back. I'm telling you, Jason had said the day after the eruption, his eyes wild with determination. We're not just dealing with natural disasters. These are targeted events. They're not random. I'm not convinced, I replied. I've seen these patterns before. Disasters happen in areas with elevated levels of human interference. It's just the natural consequence of our actions. Jason shook his head, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. But the patterns are too specific. It's not just about deforestation. It's about the ecosystems being systematically dismantled, the oceans poisoned, the air thick with carbon. It's all connected. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Something had shifted. The Earth was no longer passive, and I didn't know how to process that idea. Was it possible that nature had turned against us? That all the damage we had inflicted was causing the planet to retaliate? Then came the next shock. The floods in Brazil were unlike anything we'd ever seen. Entire towns had been submerged, rivers swollen with torrential rain that seemed to fall from nowhere. Satellite images showed entire sections of the Amazon flooded, turning the once thriving rainforest into a muddy wasteland. We're seeing this all over the world, Alana said, her voice tight as she examined the flood data. These aren't just normal floods. The way they're spreading, look at the areas they're targeting. She pulled up a heat map of Brazil, showing the worst-hit regions. It was impossible to ignore. The floods were centered around deforested areas, illegal logging camps, and the ever-expanding agricultural zones. The very regions that had been most exploited were the hardest hit. "Do you see it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the same as Sumatra. It's the same as the volcano. The Earth is reacting, and it's not random." Sean, who had been listening in silence, crossed his arms. "You can't seriously believe that the Earth is doing this on purpose. We're talking about nature, not a sentient being." "I don't know what it is," Jason replied, "but the evidence is right in front of us. The patterns are too consistent. These aren't just natural disasters anymore. They're like the planet is pushing back against us." I stood there staring at the maps, trying to make sense of it all. How could this be happening? The idea that the Earth was actively retaliating felt too far-fetched, even for someone like Jason. But as the days passed and more disasters occurred, I couldn't deny it. There was a pattern. The floods in Brazil were just the beginning. The next disaster came swiftly. A series of wildfires erupted in California, spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. The flames devoured entire towns, turning forests into ash in a matter of hours. The destruction was catastrophic, and the fires seemed to strike in places that were shockingly familiar suburbs that had once been forested land, regions that had been cleared for development or agricultural expansion. "Look at this," Jason said one night, his voice barely audible over the crackling static of the lab's intercom. "The fires. Look at where they're burning." I glanced at the screen. "The same areas. What are you trying to say?" "It's not just coincidence," Jason replied, his hands shaking slightly as he zoomed in on the fire data. "These fires are burning the places where we've done the most damage. It's not random. The Earth is targeting these areas." Alana stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. "But it's impossible. The Earth can't think. It can't make decisions like this." "Maybe it doesn't think like we do," Jason said, his voice distant. "But it's responding. It's like a system under stress, reacting to the pressure we've put on it." I was silent. The evidence was mounting, but it was still too unbelievable. The Earth fighting back against us? It sounded like something out of a dystopian novel, not something that could be happening in real time. But every disaster, every flood, every fire, every earthquake seemed to fit into this growing pattern. I couldn't ignore it any longer. "It's like the planet is telling us to stop," Alana said, her voice barely a whisper. "Like it's warning us that if we don't change, it's going to get worse." Jason turned to face her. "That's exactly what I've been saying. But it's worse than we thought. We just don't need to stop. We need to undo everything we've done. We need to show the Earth we're serious about change." I felt a chill run through me. The weight of Jason's words settled in my chest. If he was right, if the Earth really was fighting back, then what we were seeing was only the beginning. The planet had the power to wipe us out, and it seemed like it was doing just that. "Are we ready for this?" I asked, my voice shaking, as the reality of the situation settled in. Jason met my gaze, his face grim. We have no choice. We either change or we perish. The implications were staggering. But as the weeks passed and more disasters struck, I began to realize that Jason wasn't being alarmist. This wasn't just the weather or a series of unlucky events. This was the Earth fighting back against us. Chapter 3: Unnatural Patterns. The weeks following the floods in Brazil and the fires in California were a blur. We were constantly on edge, watching the world unravel in real time, and yet we couldn't pull away. Every piece of data we collected seemed to confirm Jason's theory. The Earth was responding, but it was unclear whether it was a cry for help or a declaration of war. The IEP lab had become a war room, a place where every disaster felt like a new battle, and we were losing ground. The team worked around the clock, poring over seismic readings, weather patterns, and environmental changes. It was a race against time. Every passing day seemed to bring another disaster, another indicator that the planet was growing angrier, more unpredictable. It was early one morning when we saw the first rogue wave. It wasn't just any wave, it was a monster. It wasn't just water, it was a wall of force, tearing steel apart like paper. The oil platform groaned, metal twisting before the entire structure vanished beneath the churning sea. The platform was a lifeline for the energy sector, and the loss was catastrophic, not only for the company, but for the fragile global energy market. Sean was the first to notice it. This isn't normal. These waves don't behave like this. There's no precedent for this kind of intensity, he said, his voice tense. I frowned. Are you saying the Earth caused it? Sean hesitated. I don't know, but I've been studying ocean currents for years. This is something else. It's too precise, too targeted. Jason, who had been pacing around the lab, stopped dead in his tracks. Sean's right. This is a message, a warning. Eric scoffed, pushing away from the table. A warning about what? That we should stop drilling for oil? Do you really think the Earth cares about our resources? It's not sentient. Jason turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. Maybe it doesn't care about oil, but it's clear it cares about what we've done to its oceans. The reefs are dying, the fish stocks are dwindling, and now this. It's like the Earth is setting boundaries. Eric threw up his hands. That's ridiculous. Nature doesn't set boundaries. It's chaos. This was a freak event, nothing more. Jason's jaw tightened. He stalked over to the monitor and slammed his hand on the console. Look at the data, Eric. Every disaster, Sumatra, Brazil, California, and now this, hits where we've done the most damage. It's too precise to be random. Eric crossed his arms. Correlation isn't causation. You know that better than anyone. You're chasing patterns that aren't there. Jason glared at him. And you're ignoring patterns that are... Daniel leaned forward, rubbing his temple. Come on, Jason. You're suggesting the Earth is choosing where to strike? Like it's alive? Jason's voice lowered, steady and cold. No, I'm saying it's reacting, like a system under attack. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. So now the Earth is some self-aware entity? What's next? It sends us a letter demanding we recycle? Jason didn't flinch. It doesn't need to think the way we do to react. You cut a tree, it bleeds sap. You poison the air, it chokes. You scorch the land, it burns back. The room fell into a tense silence. Alana, who had been quietly scanning satellite data, finally spoke. Look at this, she said, pointing to the screen. The rogue wave didn't just appear, it struck here, the most polluted stretch of ocean on the planet, right above the largest dead zone. Eric stared at the map but shook his head. Coincidence? No, Jason snapped. Deliberate. Daniel leaned back, arms crossed. You can't prove that, and until you can, this is all just paranoia. Jason took a slow, steady breath, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And what if it's not? What if this is nature's last warning? Silence. Sean's voice cut through the tension. It's like an immune response. Jason turned to him, eyes sharp. Exactly. The planet is reacting to us the way a body fights an infection. It's trying to protect itself. Eric shook his head slowly. If that's true, then we're already dead. Jason's expression hardened. Not if we act now, but if we waste time arguing, we're finished. Alana leaned forward. So what do we do? Just wait for the next disaster? Jason shook his head. No, we act. We need to start undoing the damage we've caused, reforest, reduce emissions, dismantle the industries poisoning the earth. We need to create earth sanctuaries, protected zones where nature can heal. Daniel snorted. You think the world will listen to that? Jason met his gaze with unwavering intensity. If they won't, then we make them listen. If we don't, the earth will do it for us. The room was quiet again, the weight of Jason's words settling over us. Alana's voice was barely a whisper. We can't undo what's been done, but we can stop the bleeding. Jason nodded. It's not just about stopping, it's about healing. Chapter 4. The First Plan. By the time we gathered for our next meeting, the world felt different. It was as if the fabric of reality itself had been torn, revealing a dark truth we were all too afraid to acknowledge. The Earth had shifted from being a passive entity to a formidable opponent, and now we had to confront the full scope of what that meant. Jason didn't waste time. He'd spent the past few days drafting a plan, Operation Rebirth, and now, standing at the head of the conference room, he looked like a general preparing his troops for battle. The weight of what was happening had transformed him, hardened him into someone willing to do whatever it took to save humanity and the planet. We've seen the Earth's response, Jason began, his voice unyielding. We've watched the disasters, the tsunamis, the fires, the hurricanes. We've seen the patterns emerge. Now we need to take action. The room was tense. The idea that we were at war with the Earth was one thing, but the reality of fighting back was another entirely. Eric leaned forward, his face hard. You're talking about dismantling civilization. Industries shut down, governments overthrown. You're asking us to give up everything we've built. Jason didn't blink. I'm not asking, I'm telling you. If we don't act now, we lose everything. Daniel shook his head. This is insane. You want us to declare war on the entire global economy? How are we supposed to dismantle oil, coal, deforestation overnight? That's suicide. Jason's jaw tightened. If we don't, the Earth will do it for us. The longer we wait, the more devastating these disasters will become. Jason pulled up a map highlighting the most devastated regions. Operation Rebirth has 3 pillars. First, we establish Earth sanctuaries, vast regions of land and sea abandoned to let nature heal. No industries, no interference, just pure, untouched ecosystems. Alana frowned. Jason, governments won't hand over critical territories. We need to focus on saving what we can. Prioritize the Amazon, the Arctic, coral reefs. Jason nodded. I agree, but we can't wait for permission. We take what we need to save. Eric scoffed. And how exactly do you plan to do that? These industries aren't going to step aside because we ask nicely. Jason's eyes darkened. Then we push them aside. Eric's chair screeched as he stood up. This isn't leadership, Jason. This is fanaticism. You're going to get us killed. Before Jason could respond, the conference room doors slammed open. Director Harris strode in, flanked by 2 grim-faced security agents. We need to talk, Harris said, voice cold. Jason didn't move. Unless you're here to help, get out. Harris tossed a thick folder onto the table. I'm here to warn you, the Department of Environmental Security has classified the IEP as a threat to national security. The room froze. Alana's face went pale. What are you talking about? Harris's expression was ice. You're under surveillance. Every communication, every move, you're walking a fine line and the government won't tolerate interference. Jason stepped forward. Interference? We're trying to save the planet. Harris glared at him. By dismantling industries critical to global stability, you're proposing sabotage, terrorism. Eric threw his hands up. See? This is exactly what I was warning about. Jason's fist clenched. If the government won't act, we will. Harris didn't flinch. Try it, and they'll shut you down permanently. I'm here as a courtesy, Jason. You won't get another warning. Jason's voice dropped to a cold whisper. Then I guess we're out of time. Harris studied him for a long moment, then turned on his heel and left. The door slammed shut. Silence. Eric spoke first, his voice low and furious. Now they're watching us. What's next, Jason? Are we going to war with the entire world? Jason's eyes burned. If that's what it takes. Daniel shook his head, stepping back. This isn't what I signed up for. I wanted to study the Earth, not destroy what's left of humanity. Jason slammed his hand on the table. Humanity is already destroying itself. I won't stand by and watch. Alana finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. Jason, they're not wrong. We need more than just a plan. We need evidence and support. Otherwise, we're finished. Jason's breath slowed, his fists unclenched. You're right, we need to move carefully, but we do need to move. He turned to the team. We start with one sanctuary, somewhere critical. We secure it and show the world it can work. The room was still tense, but the spark of a real plan was forming. Alana leaned in. If we're doing this, we need proof, data, evidence that this is the only way. Jason nodded slowly. Then let's get it. Before anyone could speak, an alarm blared. Red lights pulsed overhead. Alana's eyes darted to the monitor. Her face went pale. Oh no, it's the Arctic! Jason's voice was razor sharp. What happened? Alana's voice trembled. The ice shelf just fractured. The room was silent. Jason's expression hardened. Then we're out of time. Chapter 5, Resistance. Operation Rebirth was designed to be a beacon of hope, a bold, definitive plan to pull humanity back from the brink of environmental collapse. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that hope alone wasn't enough. Resistance came swiftly from every corner of the globe. The first signs of pushback came from the media. Corporate-backed pundits seized the opportunity to cast doubt on the science behind the IEP's findings, labeling Jason's theories as extreme and unsubstantiated. Headlines screamed across news outlets. Operation Rebirth, radical science, or economic suicide. IEP pushes pseudoscience, threatens global stability. The term pseudoscientific was tossed around with reckless abandon, as if dismissing the facts outright could make them disappear. But the real fight was just beginning. Jason, still holding firm to his unshakable belief that the Earth's retaliation was both real and unstoppable, began working with Alana and the rest of the team to build a more solid public-facing case. They knew they needed to show the world not just the severity of the Earth's response, but the scientific evidence that justified their radical solutions. One morning, Jason called an emergency meeting, his face tight with frustration. We've got 2 weeks, he said. The first global conference on Operation Rebirth is in 2 weeks, and the pressure is mounting. We need to be ready for the blowback. The corporations are already lobbying against us, and governments are hesitating. Eric, always the pragmatist, leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. So what's the plan? Present the data and hope for the best? No, Jason replied, shaking his head. We need more than data. We need to show the world that the cost of inaction is extinction. That's the only argument that will cut through the noise, Alana added, her eyes narrowed as she stared at the data on her screen. We're pulling the rug out from under a global system that has supported entire economies for centuries. That's going to hurt. It's going to cause disruption. We have to prepare for the fallout. Daniel, who had been largely quiet throughout this session, finally spoke up. There's more than just economic disruption. People are afraid, fear will drive resistance, and it won't be the kind we can talk our way out of. We need to anticipate civil unrest. Jason nodded, his face grim. I know, we've prepared for the worst, but we also have a chance to present a vision of hope, if we can just get the world to see it. The room fell silent as each person absorbed the weight of Jason's words. The plan was ambitious, but the stakes couldn't have been higher. Failure wasn't an option. That evening, as I sat alone in the lab, poring over maps of areas most at risk from climate change, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in my gut. It wasn't just the opposition from outside the IEP, there was something else, something more personal. I could hear voices outside my door. Jason and Eric arguing in hushed tones. They'd been doing that a lot lately. Jason was stubborn, unwavering. But Eric had started to doubt. "Jason, you're asking for the impossible." Eric's voice rang through the thin walls. "We're not going to get the support we need. Governments won't go for it. They're too entrenched in the systems that have created this mess. And the corporations, have you seen the lobbying efforts? They'll stop at nothing to keep their profits." Jason's voice was calm, but the tension in it was palpable. "We don't have a choice. We're fighting for humanity's future." "I get that," Eric snapped, "but we're also fighting against years of systemic power. We can't just pull the plug on everything. There has to be a middle ground." There was a pause before Jason responded. "There is no middle ground, not anymore. We've already crossed the line. The Earth is retaliating, and if we don't stop the damage, it won't matter what kind of economy we have. We won't have a planet left to fight for." I could hear Eric's heavy sigh and then the sound of footsteps moving away from the door. The arguments were growing more frequent now, but Jason wasn't backing down, and neither was Eric. The day of the global conference arrived. The tension in the air was palpable. Leaders from around the world had gathered to hear the IEP's official proposals, but the atmosphere was thick with skepticism. The corporate lobbyists were in full force, with their talking points ready to attack the validity of the IEP's findings. The media was already speculating about the potential economic collapse that could result from Jason's radical vision. Outside the conference hall, protesters clashed, some holding signs that read, "Save the Earth," while others waved banners declaring economic freedom. The divide was growing. We sat at the front of the room, facing a sea of skeptical faces. Jason stood, unwavering as always, at the podium. His expression was a mixture of determination and exhaustion. But there was no turning back now. He began with a simple statement, but one that carried the weight of everything we had worked for. "We are here today because we are at the edge of a precipice. If we do not act now, the Earth will not give us another chance." Alana stepped forward, showing maps and projections of future climate scenarios. She explained how, even with current emissions trends, the disasters would only escalate. With each image, she illustrated the devastating consequences of inaction. "We have to stop now, or it will be too late," she said, her voice steady. But the pushback came swiftly. A CEO in a tailored suit stood, his voice smooth but cold. "These are hypothetical scenarios, unsupported by real-world evidence. We cannot destroy the global economy based on unverified models." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Jason's response was calculated, his voice cutting through the doubts. "You're right, these models are projections, but the data we have and the real-world disasters we've already seen are not hypothetical. The Earth has given us a warning. It's up to us whether we listen." The debate continued, spiraling into heated exchanges, but Jason and Alana held their ground. The opposition was strong, but we had data on our side. We had science, the evidence, and, more than anything, the truth. Chapter 6, The Crossroads. The week following the global conference was a blur of activity. Every major news outlet ran debates discussing the feasibility of Operation Rebirth. The headlines were a mix of skepticism, support, and outright hostility. But one thing was clear: the battle had only just begun. In private, the IEP team felt the weight of the growing opposition. As Jason walked through the research wing of their headquarters, the sounds of dissent were hard to ignore. The corporate world was pushing back harder than they'd anticipated, launching a multifaceted campaign to discredit the IEP. Jason knew the fight ahead wouldn't just be political, it would be a cultural war. "Jason," Alana said one afternoon, catching him before he disappeared into another meeting, "we need to address the elephant in the room. Eric's starting to unravel." Jason stopped and turned toward her. "What do you mean?" "He's been meeting with the UN representatives behind your back. They're pushing for a compromise, something less radical. I think he's considering it." Jason's jaw tightened. "He's not one to compromise." "Exactly," she replied, crossing her arms. "And that's why this is serious. He's been asking questions that suggest he's losing faith in our approach, losing faith in us. Jason felt a pang of frustration. He had always believed in the power of the team, and Eric had been one of their most steadfast allies. But this uncertainty, it was shaking him. Later that day, Jason finally confronted Eric. The tension between them was palpable. "Eric, I need to understand what's going on," Jason began, his voice sharp but controlled. "Why are you meeting with the UN in secret? Why are you pushing for something less than what we agreed upon?" Eric's eyes were tired, as though the weight of their mission was becoming unbearable. "Because, Jason, we're about to tear the entire world apart. These plans, they're too radical. I'm not saying we don't need change, but what?" Jason's voice rose slightly. "What do you want? To go back to the same old systems that got us into this mess?" "I'm not suggesting we go backward," Eric said, his voice laced with frustration. "But there has to be a middle ground. We're asking for the collapse of entire industries. Do you even understand the magnitude of that?" Jason's heart hammered in his chest. "I do. I understand it better than anyone, but it's the only way forward. If we don't act now, we won't have any industries left to save." Eric looked away, clearly struggling. A leaked memo on Jason's desk flashed in his mind. A draft resolution from the UN supporting Eric's incremental plan. This wasn't just dissent, this was sabotage. "I just don't want to be responsible for the chaos that will come with it. We're playing with fire here." Jason stood still, feeling the weight of Eric's words. The room fell silent for a long moment. Finally, Jason spoke again, his tone softer. "Eric, I don't want chaos either, but the Earth isn't waiting for us to find a middle ground. We don't have time to compromise anymore. We need bold action, and we need it now." As the days dragged on, the tension inside the IEP headquarters escalated. The team was becoming divided. Eric had started gathering support for his compromise, quietly lobbying members of the United Nations and certain influential corporate leaders, trying to shift the mission away from Operation Rebirth's complete overhaul of society. Meanwhile, Jason, Alana, and Daniel worked tirelessly to make their case. They presented new projections to the world, showing the catastrophic impact of delaying action. Every new study, every new data set was a weapon to be wielded in their fight to prove the urgency of their cause. But as public pressure mounted, so did the opposition. A well-organized coalition of corporations, political figures, and media moguls began rallying against the plan. The global economy was their primary concern. Millions of jobs were tied to fossil fuel industries, to deforestation, to unsustainable agricultural practices. The idea of dismantling those industries for the sake of the Earth's survival felt like an impossible dream to many. In the midst of these tensions, the first direct signs of societal unrest began to surface. Protests broke out in major cities around the world. Some supported the IEP's efforts, demanding immediate action to address the climate crisis. Others, however, were violently opposed to the disruption they believed would come from Jason's plan. From strikes in oil-producing regions to civil disobedience in financial hubs, it became clear that the world was split in two. Jason stared at an anonymous message flashing on his phone. "Control your people, or we will." The opposition was becoming more dangerous. The media was relentless. Talk shows fueled the fire, interviewing economists who painted dystopian pictures of mass unemployment, bankrupt industries, and a world teetering on the brink of collapse. But there were also stories of grassroots movements springing up in support of Jason's mission, individuals who believed in the Earth's call for change. One evening, Jason found himself alone in his office, staring at the massive whiteboard covered in charts, graphs, and projections. The data they had gathered was irrefutable, but it felt as though no one was listening. Every day, the world seemed to move further away from the kind of radical transformation they had proposed. Alana entered the room, her face serious. "There's something you need to see." She handed him a tablet, showing the latest poll results. Public opinion was shifting. The support for Operation Rebirth had plummeted in recent weeks, and now the majority of the population seemed to favor Eric's compromise, a slower, more incremental approach to environmental change. Jason's heart sank as he looked at the numbers. Was it too late to turn the tide? I don't know if we can keep going at this pace, Jason murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Alana didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply looked at him, her eyes filled with both determination and concern. We've come too far to give up now, Jason. It's not about who's right. It's about what we're willing to fight for. We can't let fear decide the future. Jason closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the choice hanging over him. He could hear the voices of opposition growing louder, the fears of collapse and economic ruin echoing in his mind. But then, another thought cut through the noise. What was the alternative? Chapter 7, Breaking Point. The IEP team was running on fumes. Every new disaster felt heavier than the last, each one tightening the noose around their mission. The media, once dismissive, now filled every screen with images of devastation. Flattened cities, flooded coasts, burning forests. It was no longer a question of if the world would change. It was happening. Alana stared at the news feed on her tablet, her hands trembling slightly. Another earthquake in the Pacific, magnitude 8.3. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. It's not slowing down, it's getting worse. Jason leaned over her shoulder, his eyes sharp but exhausted. Because the Earth is fighting back. We've crossed the line, and now it's pushing back harder than we could have predicted. There was a tightness in his chest that wouldn't ease. Every disaster felt personal now. Every image of crushed buildings and shattered lives was a reminder that they had failed to act fast enough. Jason knew the world was fragile, but now it was breaking. The unfolding crisis. The Gulf Coast was the first to crumble under the strain. What was once a routine hurricane season had turned into a cataclysm. Cyclone Atlas. Winds ripped through the region at over 200 miles per hour, flattening cities, ripping entire communities from the earth. Neighborhoods that once thrived were now little more than scattered debris. Jason stared at the satellite feed, watching the storm spiral like a living monster. "We warned them," he murmured. His voice was hollow. "We told them this would happen." Daniel leaned in, his face pale. "We still have a chance to stop this. But if we wait any longer..." He didn't finish. Jason didn't need him to. The escalation. It wasn't just the Gulf Coast. In the Midwest, earthquakes split the ground open near fracking sites. In Europe, ancient cities drowned under unprecedented floods. In the Amazon, fires raged, not caused by drought, but by greed. Illegal loggers and corporations, desperate to cling to their profits, burned the forest faster than it could regrow. Jason's phone buzzed. A message flashed on the screen. "If you won't stop, we will." Jason's grip tightened until his knuckles turned white. This wasn't just political resistance anymore. This was war, internal fractures. But the greatest threat wasn't outside, it was within. Jason burst into the meeting room to find Eric hunched over a table with a UN delegate, classified IEP documents scattered between them. Jason froze. "This isn't what it looks like," Eric said too quickly. Jason's throat tightened. "It looks like betrayal." Eric stood, his face pale but defiant. "Jason, listen to me. The world isn't ready for this. They're scared and you're pushing them too far. We need to scale back." Jason's voice was razor sharp. "We don't have time to scale back. Every second we waste, more people die." Eric's eyes hardened. "And if we bulldoze forward, we might be responsible for millions more." Jason stared him down. "Is that why you leaked our data to the UN? You think slowing down will save us?" Eric didn't answer. Jason's fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't doubt anymore, Eric. This is sabotage." The summit. The emergency summit was suffocating. Jason stood at the podium, his voice echoing through the vast hall filled with world leaders, corporate moguls, and military officials. "We have reached the tipping point," Jason began. "The disasters we're witnessing are not isolated. They are a direct response to the damage we've inflicted on this planet." He paused, scanning the room. "We need to dismantle the industries poisoning the earth. We need to restructure our economies. This isn't a choice anymore. It's survival." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A CEO rose to speak, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're asking for global economic suicide. You'll collapse entire nations with this insanity." Jason's eyes didn't waver. What's the alternative? Burn with the rest of the planet? Before the man could answer, the massive screen behind Jason flickered. Alana's panicked voice crackled in his earpiece. Jason, we've got a problem! The screen lit up with breaking news. Massive earthquake triggers Pacific tsunami. Waves approaching major coastal cities. Gas filled the room. Jason seized the moment. This is what waiting looks like, he shouted. How many more warnings do you need? But before anyone could respond, the ground trembled beneath them. Chandeliers swayed. Cracks splintered across the marble floor. An aide screamed. Jason's heart pounded. The earthquake wasn't just on the screen. It was here. The collapse. Jason barely heard Alana's voice through the chaos. Jason, get out of there! Security scrambled to usher the delegates toward the exits, but panic had already taken hold. Jason didn't move. This is it, he whispered. A deafening crack split the ceiling. Chunks of plaster rained down. Jason's eyes locked on Eric, frozen in the chaos. For a fleeting second, Jason saw the fear in Eric's eyes, but there was no more time. Jason lunged forward, and the ceiling came crashing down. Chapter 8. Fractured Alliances. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscapes. Across the globe, the signs of distress were becoming impossible to ignore. Political structures were crumbling, and the Earth's ecosystem was in freefall. The IEP's headquarters, hidden beneath the remnants of a forgotten city, was one of the few places left where urgency met action. But even here, cracks were starting to form. The team had been working for weeks without rest, coordinating relief efforts, analyzing the latest environmental data, and trying to anticipate the next catastrophe. Each day brought new challenges, new obstacles, especially with the rise of global unrest. Governments, corporations, and rogue states were pulling in different directions, each with their own version of reality, their own vision of what needed to be done. What was once a unified cause was now splintering under pressure. Alana leaned over a table covered in reports, her brow furrowed. The numbers didn't lie, but the responses? Those were filled with inconsistencies and loopholes. Leaders were clinging to old structures, as if refusing to acknowledge the truth. Every attempt to unite the fractured nations of the world seemed to hit a brick wall. The natural disasters were getting worse, the ecological damage irreparable, and yet people were still negotiating for their own advantage. Alana ran a hand through her hair, feeling a cold knot of frustration tighten in her stomach. If only it were that simple. If only she could pull the data together and force the world to accept it. But the world was too busy fighting for power. Sean's desperation. Sean stared out of the window, his mind heavy with doubts. He had been the one to build the outreach networks, to foster connections between governments and organizations. But now it all felt like a futile exercise. He couldn't even get a straight answer from most of the leaders he'd once spoken to with ease. They were all too busy protecting their own interests to listen to the stark truth. Every call, every email he sent seemed to hit a brick wall. The division between nations was growing wider. Those in positions of power were clinging to their old ways, unwilling to consider the radical changes that were necessary. Sean had always believed in the power of diplomacy, in the idea that if you just talked long enough, you could find a way forward. But he was running out of time, and so was the world. He turned sharply, his eyes meeting Jason's as the leader of the IEP entered the room. "We're running out of options," Sean said, his voice tight with frustration. "I've reached out to every political leader we know, and the best we get is empty promises. It's like they can't even see the emergency anymore." Jason walked over, his expression grim but determined. "Because they don't want to see it," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of truth. "They're too invested in the old system to change. They've spent decades building their power bases and aren't about to throw it all away for the planet. It's the same everywhere." Sean's fists clenched. "We're not talking about politics anymore. People are dying. The Earth itself is changing in ways we can't control. What's the point of all this if they won't act?" Jason paused, watching him closely. "I know," he said quietly. But it's not about them anymore, Sean. We need to do what we can. We can't wait for them to wake up. Jason's resolve. The weight of responsibility that pressed down on Jason was heavier than ever. As the leader of the IEP, his job had always been to make tough decisions, to hold the team together, and to keep pushing forward even when the odds were stacked against them. But now the stakes had changed. The world wasn't just teetering on the edge, it was already falling. Jason's phone buzzed. A message flashed on the screen. "One more step and you'll regret it." His grip tightened. This wasn't just resistance anymore. This was a threat. He had hoped that by uniting the global community, they could stave off the worst of the disaster. But as the fractures deepened, as alliances fractured and nations began to hoard resources, Jason realized that their fight wasn't just against the Earth's changing landscape. It was against human greed, corruption, and short-sightedness. The phone buzzed again. A message from Eric. "The Pacific Ring of Fire is active. Expect more significant seismic activity soon. The simulations show catastrophic results for the eastern seaboard of Asia." Jason's jaw tightened as he read the words. Another disaster. Another region to prepare. Another set of lives at risk. "Prepare for the worst," Jason muttered to himself, his gaze still fixed on the message. It was a mantra that had kept him going. Prepare, act, survive. But the world was moving faster than they could react, and the line between preparation and disaster was growing thinner by the day. Alana's fractured belief. Alana stood over a large projection screen, her mind racing as she analyzed the newest data on rising sea levels. They were increasing at an alarming rate, threatening to overwhelm entire continents in the next few decades. The worst part? People were still debating whether climate change was real. Her optimism, once a key part of her personality, was starting to fade. Her role had always been to interpret the data, to find solutions. But she was starting to wonder whether it was even possible anymore. Her thoughts were interrupted by Jason. "Alana, the Eastern Pacific is showing early signs of a major earthquake. We need to coordinate evacuation procedures." She nodded, forcing her doubts aside. "We need to take charge. If governments won't act, we must. I'll start preparing the data for a global evacuation protocol." The push to act. Jason gathered the team. "We can't wait for bureaucracies to move. Sean, hijack global emergency channels. Alana, send real-time updates to coastal regions. Stephen, prepare the supply chains for rapid deployment. We act now." Sean hesitated. "Jason, this could cause global panic, or worse, we might trigger international conflict." Jason's eyes hardened. "If we wait, millions will die. We act now." As the IEP launched their unauthorized global alerts, the world braced for impact. The fractures in global unity deepened. But Jason knew hesitation was no longer an option. The Earth wasn't waiting, and neither could they. The final decision. Later that evening, as the team gathered around the central conference table, the weight of their collective decision settled in. This was no longer a matter of responding to events. They were now the ones taking the lead. The fractures that had slowly been forming between nations were now becoming visible even within their own ranks. Jason addressed the team, his voice unwavering. "We can't afford to wait for governments to respond. We need to move ahead with our plans, starting with the Pacific regions most at risk. Sean, get the evacuation protocols out. Stephen, optimize the logistics for moving people to safety." Sean nodded, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. He had always prided himself on his diplomatic skills, his ability to mediate conflicts and build consensus. But now, with the clock ticking, he knew there was no room for compromise. It was a hard truth to swallow, especially for someone like him, who had always believed in collaboration over confrontation. "It's a risk," Sean said, speaking the unspoken thought aloud. "We're moving forward without approval. We don't have the luxury of waiting for formal channels." "I know," Jason replied, his voice low, "but the risk of inaction is far greater than anything we might face by acting first. We're out of time." Alana's burden. As the operations were set in motion, Alana sat alone in her lab, staring at the oceanic simulation data. The images flickered on the screen, showing the projected path of the tsunami. It was a nightmare. Entire cities would be wiped off the map, their populations caught unprepared, vulnerable to the full force of nature's wrath. She couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. It was her research that had led to this moment. She had been the one to predict the coming disaster, the one who had seen it unfold in simulations days before anyone else had. But that didn't make it any easier. She had spent years working in labs, tracking patterns, running simulations. Now she was living in the reality she had once only studied from afar. The numbers, the graphs, the predictive models, none of it had ever truly prepared her for the sheer scale of destruction she was witnessing now. She rubbed her eyes, forcing herself to focus. There was no room for hesitation. They had made the call. There was no turning back. "Get it together, Alana," she muttered to herself. "The world is depending on you." Stephen's calculations. Meanwhile, Stephen was in his office reviewing the logistics of their mission. Every decision, every move they made had to be precise. The world was a powder keg, and any misstep could ignite an even bigger crisis. While most of the team focused on the immediate threat of the tsunami, Stephen was thinking ahead. How could they mobilize long-term relief once the crisis passed? The tsunami might be a temporary event, but the aftermath would last for years. People would need shelter, food, water, medical supplies. If they were going to take control of the situation, they couldn't just think in terms of disaster relief. They had to think in terms of recovery, of rebuilding. "Eric," Stephen said, calling over the communication line, "we'll need more than just emergency shelters. I want to know the status of sustainable housing initiatives in the affected areas. We can't afford to give them temporary fixes." On the other end, Eric's voice crackled. "Got it, Stephen. I'll pull up the data on the sustainable projects. But you know that those won't be ready in time, right?" "I know," Stephen said, tapping his pen against the table. "But if we don't start planning now, we're going to be rebuilding this same ground for years to come." Sean's moment of clarity. That night, as Sean walked through the quiet halls of the headquarters, he felt a wave of exhaustion settle over him. His role had always been to be the diplomat, to bridge the gap between competing interests. But now, there was no room for compromise. There was only action. He stopped at a window, staring out at the sprawling city below. Once a hub of power and progress, now just another casualty in a world that seemed to be crumbling from the inside out. He thought about his family, his friends, the people he had known before all this began. They would never understand the choices he had to make now. For a brief moment, doubt crept into his mind. Were they doing the right thing? Were they making the right call? But then he thought of the millions of people who would be affected by the coming disaster, and the answer became clear. He wasn't doing this for political gain. He wasn't doing this for fame or recognition. He was doing it because someone had to. "Time to step up," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Jason's leadership. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, Jason stood at the head of the conference table, watching the world's response unfold on his screen. Alerts were being sent, evacuations were starting, resources were being mobilized. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment where he had to lead, not as a diplomat, but as someone who had to make hard calls. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about saving whatever was left of humanity. He knew the consequences of their actions. They would be labeled as rogues, as rebels, as outlaws. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the lives that would be saved. What mattered was the future for which they were fighting for. "We're in this together," Jason said, his voice steady as he addressed the team. "We may not have the world's support, but we have each other. Let's make it count." The storm was coming, and with it, the final test of the IEP's resolve. Would they stand united in the face of global disaster? Or would the fractures among them, born of uncertainty, fear, and political ambition, tear them apart? Only time would tell. The quiet before the storm. The next few days were a blur. The team worked tirelessly, orchestrating the largest and most complex evacuation operation in modern history. With each passing hour, the reality of their decisions set in. They were now acting as a global authority, bypassing national governments and taking matters into their own hands. The ramifications of this move would be enormous. But for now, there was only one priority: survival. Alana had transitioned from monitoring the seismic data to overseeing evacuation efforts in the Pacific region. While Jason and Sean focused on international strategy, she was deep in the heart of operations, working with local emergency response teams to ensure the safe relocation of people from high-risk areas. The pressure was immense. Every second counted, every decision had to be calculated, and every failure could cost lives. As Alana sat in front of a map coordinating the next phase of their operation, her mind kept circling back to the people she knew she could not save. The flood of refugees was already overwhelming evacuation centers, and there were not enough boats or helicopters to carry them all. How would they make it in time? The questions gnawed at her, but she pushed them aside. She had to focus on the task at hand. Meanwhile, Sean was coordinating with government leaders, trying to push them into taking action, though it was clear that many were still hesitant. Their diplomatic alliances were on the line, but Sean's frustration with their delay was palpable. Time was running out, and it seemed that some leaders were more concerned with posturing and securing political advantages than saving lives. "Sean," Jason said one morning as they huddled in the war room, "we're beyond diplomacy now. The time for negotiations is over. We act or we lose." Sean nodded, his hands tight on the edge of the table. "I know, but some of these governments won't take kindly to being sidelined. What happens if they retaliate?" "Let them," Jason said coldly. "We're acting for the greater good. That's all that matters." The cost of leadership. As the days turned into a tense countdown, Stephen's mind was preoccupied with something else: the cost of their actions. Not just in terms of international fallout, but in terms of resources. They had called in every favor, pushed every contact, and scrambled to pull together the necessary logistics to move millions of people to safety. And still, it wasn't enough. "Eric," Stephen said during one of their late-night strategy sessions, "I need a report on the status of the relief supplies. We need more medical units, more food, more water. This thing is growing too fast. What do we have?" On the other end of the line, Eric's voice sounded strained. "We're doing what we can, but it's getting harder. The supply chains are being stretched thin. Every country is now scrambling for resources. We might have to look at local sourcing at some point." Stephen pinched the bridge of his nose. "Keep pushing. I don't care how, but we cannot let this effort fail." As he hung up the phone, Stephen felt a sudden weight settle in his chest. They were fighting a war on multiple fronts, one against the disaster itself, and the other against the fragile state of global cooperation. And he knew that the success of their mission hinged not just on the physical logistics, but on the willingness of people to come together when everything around them was falling apart. The tension mounts. Jason's leadership had been unyielding, but it was clear that the stress of their decision was starting to show. As the evacuation began in earnest, reports came in from all over the Pacific, detailing the destruction in the aftermath of the tremors. Some regions were already beyond help, their populations lost to the violent waves. There was no turning back now. The storm was hitting, and they could only try to stay ahead of its destruction. The world watched in a mixture of awe and fear as the IEP, once a shadowy organization in the background of global affairs, now became the center of attention. They were both saviors and outlaws, depending on who you asked. The political leaders who had been slow to act were now demanding answers, questioning the legitimacy of the IEP's interventions. There were whispers of scandal, of overreach, of a new world order being imposed from above. But Jason ignored the noise. His focus was on one thing: saving as many people as possible. He knew that the weight of their decision would be felt long after the disaster passed. It was a burden that no one had asked for, but one they had willingly taken on. And now they had to see it through. Sean, however, could not ignore the growing tensions within their ranks. The political fallout was unavoidable. As the world began to question the IEP's motives, cracks appeared in the coalition they had worked so hard to build. Some allies voiced concerns about the path they were taking. Others questioned the IEP's authority in a world that was no longer united under the same banner of leadership. Sean knew that every decision they made now would have a far-reaching impact. A moment of reflection. One evening, as the team gathered in the makeshift operations room, Alana pulled Jason aside, her face a mask of exhaustion. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going," she admitted, her voice quiet. "We're doing everything we can, but I'm not sure it's enough." Jason studied her, understanding the weight of what she was saying. He had seen the toll this was taking on each of them. They were all running on fumes, physically, emotionally, and mentally. But they couldn't afford to stop. "We keep going because we have no choice," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've made the decision. There's no turning back now." Alana nodded, though the doubt in her eyes lingered. "I know. But when does it end, Jason? When do we know that we've done enough?" Jason didn't have an answer. He only knew that they had to keep pushing forward, no matter what. There was no time to question, no room for second guessing. The storm was here, and they had to meet it head-on. The calm after the storm. As the first waves of the tsunami hit, it became clear that the disaster was as devastating as they had feared. The IEP's efforts were no longer about evacuations or logistics. They were about survival. With every passing hour, the situation worsened. The storm was now a full-blown catastrophe, and the IEP's response would determine whether or not the world could survive in the wake of such destruction. But amidst the chaos, a new sense of unity began to form. People, governments, and organizations, many of whom had been reluctant to act or even acknowledge the IEP's authority, found themselves banding together in the face of common threats. The storm was too great, too powerful to ignore, and for the first time in years, the fractures that had divided nations seemed to fade in the wake of the destruction. Jason, Sean, Alana, and Stephen watched the chaos unfold from their command center, each of them wondering what the future would look like once the dust settled. The cost of their decision would be tallied soon enough. But for now, they had done everything they could. The world had been fractured, but perhaps, just perhaps, they had the chance to rebuild it stronger than before. The storm rages on, and with it, the tension that binds them all. The IEP's fate is now intertwined with the future of humanity. The lines between heroism and villainy blur, and only time will tell whether their actions will be remembered as a courageous fight for survival or a reckless leap into uncharted waters. Chapter 9, The Breaking Point. Aftermath. The devastation caused by the tsunami was unlike anything anyone had expected. With waves reaching heights of over 100 feet in some regions, entire cities were swallowed whole. Thousands of miles of coastline were wiped clean, leaving nothing but rubble in their wake. The global community was left reeling, struggling to comprehend the scale of the destruction. The IEP's evacuation efforts, while swift and determined, were far from enough. Their resources were stretched to the breaking point, and the sheer volume of people they had to save seemed to grow by the hour. They had underestimated the scale of the storm, and now they were paying the price. Alana, standing in front of a massive digital map in the operations room, stared at the red blotches marking the worst-hit areas. The numbers flashed before her eyes: millions displaced, hundreds of thousands confirmed dead. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest. She had never felt so helpless. "We can't keep up," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "Every time we move people, more flood in. Every island we evacuate, a dozen more sink." Jason was beside her, his expression unreadable. "We're doing everything we can. We have to hold on. We don't have enough ships, enough supplies. The situation is worsening by the minute," Alana said, her voice thick with frustration. Sean, overhearing, walked over, his face drawn with exhaustion. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we're not going to give up. There's no choice." "No choice," she repeated bitterly. "You keep saying that, but it doesn't change the facts. We're running out of time, and we're running out of people." Jason raised a hand to calm the tension. "Alana, I understand, but we can't let despair take over. We have to keep pushing forward. If we stop now, we'll lose everything. A global reckoning." Elsewhere, the world was watching. Governments that had once been hesitant to cooperate with the IEP now found themselves seeking assistance. But it was clear that the IEP, while having the capacity to move millions, did not have the ability to provide everything these countries needed. The scale of the destruction had surpassed anyone's wildest predictions, and no one, not even the IEP, was truly prepared. Meanwhile, the political fallout of the IEP's unilateral actions was beginning to show. Some countries condemned them for acting outside of international law, while others accused them of hoarding resources and prioritizing the powerful over the vulnerable. In the media, the debate was growing louder, and the IEP's legitimacy was being questioned. Was this really a global rescue operation? Or was it the start of a new world order? One where the IEP decided who lived and who died? Sean's role had never been more critical, but it was also more complicated. He found himself navigating not just the global political arena, but also the growing dissent within the IEP's own ranks. Some members who had initially supported the bold decisions were beginning to waver. The toll of the disaster, combined with the growing political pressure, was creating fractures in the alliance. "We need to address optics," Sean said during an emergency meeting. "If we don't calm the political storm, this whole operation could crumble." "I don't care about optics," Jason snapped, his voice harsher than usual. "People are dying. That's what matters." "I agree," Sean said, his voice steady but insistent. "But we can't ignore the reality that our authority is being questioned. We need to start reaching out to governments, even the ones that have resisted us. We can't afford to alienate everyone." Jason clenched his fists. "If we start appeasing them, we risk losing control. We can't afford to play politics when lives are at stake." "You're right," Sean replied. "But if we want to continue acting without obstruction, we need a coalition. It's not about appeasement, it's about survival. And if we don't build those bridges now, we might lose everything we fought for." Jason took a deep breath. "Fine, but the moment they start slowing us down, we move forward without them." Shadows of doubt. As the days turned into weeks, the strain of leadership was beginning to show. The once unified front of the IEP now seemed to fracture under the weight of impossible choices. Alana, once a resolute force in the field, was beginning to question the long-term sustainability of their mission. Each day, the numbers of displaced people seemed to multiply, and the resources they had fought so hard to gather were dwindling. "I don't know if we can do this much longer," she confessed to Stephen one evening, her voice quiet, exhausted. "How do we continue? We're stretched so thin, and every new wave of refugees seems to overwhelm us more than the last." Stephen, who had been a constant source of strength for the team, looked at her with a deep, knowing gaze. "The world isn't going to stop needing us, Alana. We don't have the luxury of doubt. We're here for a reason." "But what if we can't save everyone?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. "We save who we can," Stephen said simply. "That's all we can do." Alana nodded, but the doubt didn't leave her. It lingered like a shadow, growing larger each day. The brink of collapse. The pressure was mounting on all fronts. Jason's once unshakable confidence was now beginning to crack under the strain. He had always been able to compartmentalize, to push through the hardest challenges. But now even he could feel the weight of the responsibility crushing him. Late one night, as the operations room hummed with activity, he found himself alone in front of a map of the affected regions, staring at the flashing red dots marking the worst-hit areas. The reports were grim. Entire nations were on the brink of collapse. Resources were running out. And despite their best efforts, the IEP's reach could only go so far. "We're losing control," he muttered under his breath, though no one was around to hear him. His phone buzzed with a message from Sean. It was brief. "The diplomatic front is unraveling. We need to address this now." Jason slammed his hand on the table. "Damn it," he muttered. He had known this day would come, the day when they would no longer be able to manage it all. The IEP had grown too large, too powerful, and now the world was beginning to see them for what they truly were, a force that could both save and destroy. Their next steps would be their most critical yet, a tipping point. The final blow came when a major city on the east coast of the Pacific was hit by an aftershock so strong it caused further devastation in an already fragile region. Thousands were killed, and the infrastructure that had been painstakingly rebuilt was destroyed again in mere hours. The reports from the rescue teams were catastrophic. For the first time since the storm began, Jason, Sean, Alana, and Stephen found themselves in the same room, staring at the data. The numbers were no longer manageable. They had done everything they could, and yet the disaster was bigger than they had imagined. "We can't do it anymore," Alana said, breaking the silence. "This isn't just about saving lives anymore. It's about how much longer we can hold on before everything unravels completely." Jason looked around at his team, his family, and for the first time he saw the doubt mirrored in their eyes. The storm wasn't just outside, it had reached them. But there was still a glimmer of resolve in him. "We keep going," he said, his voice low but steady. "We have no choice. If we stop now, it's over, and we can't let that happen." The team exchanged weary glances. There was no turning back, but even as they spoke of survival, they knew the real battle had just begun. The disaster might have caused the world to crumble, but it was the choices they made in the aftermath that would decide its fate. Chapter 10: The Cost of Survival. Weight of decisions. As the days wore on, the toll of the storm's aftermath began to take its toll on the IEP's leadership. Every decision became heavier. Every action carried the weight of countless lives. Jason had always prided himself on being decisive, on acting swiftly to save those in need. But now every choice seemed to come with an equal amount of sacrifice. "We're stretched too thin," Jason muttered, staring out of the conference room window at the horizon. "There's no more room to expand operations. We're at capacity, and yet the calls keep coming. People keep dying." Alana stood nearby, her arms crossed as she considered his words. "We can't stop. We've come too far. But we need a plan. We can't just react anymore. We need to be proactive." Jason shook his head. "The storm's aftermath isn't something we can plan for. We can't anticipate the scale of this disaster. Every day it's a new crisis, a new fire to put out." Sean entered the room, his expression weary but determined. "We need to reassess. We've got countries starting to withdraw their support. They're questioning whether we're actually doing more harm than good. And the media is starting to call us a rogue organization." Alana sighed. "It's a power struggle. We're no longer seen as a savior organization. We're a threat. The moment we took charge of global operations, we became a target." Jason ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the world pressing against him. "We can't afford to lose our alliances now. We've already stretched resources to the limit, and if we lose support, we'll be left with nothing." A political gamble. While the leadership of the IEP wrestled with the internal crisis, the world outside was in turmoil. Nations that had once been allies now eyed the IEP with suspicion. The political instability that had followed the global disaster was now a full-fledged crisis of its own. The United Nations had called for an emergency session, a meeting to address the growing concerns over the IEP's unchecked power. Nations from every continent had sent representatives, each with their own agenda. There were calls for reform within the IEP, demands for accountability, and accusations of authoritarianism. Sean, who had always navigated the political waters with ease, now found himself walking a tightrope. One wrong move and the entire IEP could collapse. "We're not going to get through this if we don't make concessions," Sean said, his voice tense as he briefed Jason and Alana. "We need to appear willing to cooperate, or we'll lose everything. We've been operating in the shadows for too long, and now the world is paying attention." Alana, who had been quiet up until this point, frowned. "Cooperate? With whom? These governments want us to scale back, but we can't do that. People are still dying." "I know," Sean replied, "but if we don't at least pretend to negotiate, we'll have no power left to make a difference." Jason, arms crossed, leaned back in his chair. "We're not here to play politics. We're here to save lives. Period. If that's what it takes, then we stand firm. We can't afford to lose ground now." Sean nodded slowly. "I agree, but it might not be a choice anymore. The pressure's building, and if we don't at least show some willingness to negotiate, we risk losing the global coalition that's been supporting us." Cracks in the foundation. The pressure from the outside world was mounting, but it was the internal fractures that threatened to break the IEP from within. Members of the organization, once united under a common cause, were beginning to fracture. A growing number of individuals within the organization believed that the IEP had gone too far. They questioned whether their role in the crisis was truly a solution or merely a temporary fix to a much larger problem. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," Stephen said one evening, his voice tired as he spoke with Alana. "The mission, the pressure, it's taking everything out of me, and I can't help but wonder if we're just putting a bandage on a broken system." Alana looked at him, her own exhaustion mirrored in his eyes. "I've thought the same thing. The more we do, the more it feels like we're not really solving anything. We're just postponing the inevitable." "The storm's still raging," Stephen said softly, "and we're only trying to contain the damage. But what about rebuilding? What about fixing what's broken?" Alana's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "We've never been able to focus on that. We're too busy reacting, and every time we think we're making progress, another disaster hits. A turn for the worse." As the global political pressure on the IEP reached new heights, another crisis emerged. A rogue faction, one that had been growing in silence since the early days of the storm, struck out. These individuals, disillusioned by the IEP's concentration of power, launched a cyber attack against the organization's operations. The attack crippled IEP communications for several days, leaving the organization blind to the real-time data coming from the field. It was a catastrophe in the making. Rescue efforts stalled, and reports of increasing death tolls flooded in from every corner of the globe. Worse yet, the attack was traced back to a group within the organization itself, a betrayal that struck deep. Jason was furious, pacing back and forth in the operations room. "How the hell did this happen?" he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "We've been under constant threat, and we missed it." Sean, who had been on the phone with intelligence operatives, hung up the receiver, his face grim. "We were too focused on external threats. We didn't think to look inward." Alana stood by the door, her face pale. "This is bad. We're not just facing a political collapse now. We're dealing with a full-scale rebellion. Survival at any cost." The next few weeks were a blur of chaos. The IEP scrambled to regain control over its systems, and the internal rebellion began to spread. The once unified front of the organization had splintered, and the trust that had once existed between its leaders was now in tatters. Every day brought new challenges, new attacks, both physical and digital, and still they had no choice but to press forward. As the world descended further into crisis, Jason, Sean, Alana, and Stephen found themselves at the helm of a ship that was beginning to sink under the weight of its own ideals. There was no turning back. Every step they took only seemed to push them further into a maze with no exit. "We'll survive this," Jason said, his voice low but resolute. "But we need to understand one thing. We can't save everyone. We can only save those who are willing to fight alongside us." "Survival isn't about numbers anymore," Alana agreed quietly. "It's about making the right choices, no matter how hard." And with that, the IEP made its choice, to survive at any cost, rallying the team. In the wake of the cyber attack and the growing internal rebellion, Jason knew that the time had come to act decisively. The IEP was on the verge of collapse, and their divided leadership was only fueling the fire. He understood that if the team didn't come together, they would be doomed. The unity that had once been their greatest strength was now their greatest vulnerability. Jason called for an emergency meeting. Every key figure in the organization was summoned, and the weight of the situation was palpable in the room as each leader filed in. Tension crackled in the air, but it was a necessary gathering. Jason couldn't afford to lose anyone else. As the last of the team members arrived, Jason stood at the front, his posture rigid. He'd never been one to display weakness, but even he could feel the weight of their collective anxiety. He cleared his throat. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about the future of this organization and the people we promised to protect," he began, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "The attack on our systems was just the beginning. We have a choice now. We can keep fighting amongst ourselves, or we can unite and turn this around." Alana stood by his side, her usual calm demeanor replaced with a steely resolve. "I know things are looking grim, but this team has been through hell and back before. We've made it through every challenge, every loss, and we've come out stronger every time. This, she gestured around the room, is no different. We've been stretched to our breaking point, but we're still standing. We can still make a difference. Sean, his face drawn but determined, nodded in agreement. We can't afford to keep fighting each other. The enemies we face are outside this room, not within. It's time to put aside our differences and focus on what we're here for: survival and the future. Jason looked over the room, his eyes meeting each individual member's gaze. He could see the weariness in their faces, the exhaustion, the doubt, but also the spark of resilience. These were the people who had carried the IEP through its darkest days. They had faced every challenge the world had thrown at them and survived, together, reaffirming bonds. Stephen, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. His voice was rough with fatigue, but there was no mistaking the fire in his eyes. We've all lost something in this fight, but we can't let that define us. We've got to look beyond our own pain. The world is still out there, still burning, and we're the only ones left who can put it out. I've been trying to protect everyone, Alana said quietly, her voice softer but no less resolute. But I've realized something. We can't save everyone, but we can save those who are willing to fight with us. We can build a future together, but we need to do it as a unified force. There was a long pause as the team absorbed her words. Slowly, each individual nodded. One by one, they stood and moved toward the center of the room. We've lost a lot, Jason said, his voice growing stronger. But we still have each other, and that's enough. This team is built on trust, and that's something we can rebuild. We've always been a family, and we need to act like one now. We're in this together. Sean gave a grim smile. This isn't going to be easy, but we don't have the luxury of easy choices. The IEP's future depends on our ability to act as one. We've all been through hell, but now it's time to turn the page. Jason stepped forward, his eyes sweeping across the team once more. We can't undo the mistakes we've made, but we can make sure we don't make them again. We're here for one reason: to save lives. And we're going to keep doing that, no matter what. With a final nod, Jason's voice grew firm. All right, here's the plan. We regrouped. We secure our assets, both digital and physical. We make sure our people are safe, that they know we're still in control. Then we put the fight to those who think they can tear us down. We rebuild the alliances we've lost, and we make it clear this organization isn't going anywhere. Strength in unity. As the meeting came to a close, Jason felt a renewed sense of purpose. The weight that had burdened him earlier seemed a little lighter, the path forwards a little clearer. But it wasn't just the plan that gave him hope. It was the people around him. Despite the fractures, despite the failures, they were still together. Jason stepped away from the table, his mind working through the next steps. He knew they couldn't wait any longer. The team needed a win. They needed to show the world and themselves that they could come back from the brink. Alana approached him, her expression a mix of concern and determination. You're sure about this? About going on the offensive? Jason gave a small smile. We don't have a choice anymore. We fight or we fall. Sean, who had been silently observing, stepped in beside them. We're with you, Jason, every step of the way. I know, Jason replied, his voice steady, but we can't do it alone. This is about every single person in the IEP. We need to bring them all together, rebuilding from the inside. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The team worked tirelessly to regain control of their systems, address the fallout from the internal rebellion, and secure their remaining resources. It was clear that the IEP's reputation had taken a massive hit, but they were determined to rebuild, not just their operations, but their credibility and trust. Jason and Alana visited every unit within the organization, holding meetings with smaller teams to reaffirm their commitment. They needed every person to feel like part of the larger mission again, to understand that the IEP wasn't just a tool of power, but a force for change. We're all part of something bigger, Alana reminded them in every briefing. Our work is more important than ever. We have the chance to shape the future, to make sure that what we've started doesn't end in failure. You're not just here to follow orders. You're here to create a better world. By the end of the week, the team had started to regain its footing. There was a sense of camaraderie again, a feeling of unity that hadn't been present since before the storm. People were beginning to believe in their cause once more, to believe in each other. Jason knew it wouldn't be enough to simply survive. The IEP needed to prove to the world that they could lead, that they could be trusted again. But for the first time in weeks, Jason felt like they had a chance. With the team behind him, Jason knew that they could rebuild. Together. The eerie silence of the IEP headquarters was interrupted only by the soft hum of computers and the distant chatter of operatives working hard at work. The toll of the past few weeks weighed heavily on every corner of the building. Jason stood at the forefront of the conference room, his eyes scanning the room full of determined faces. But beneath the surface of their resolve, the strain was undeniable. They were fighters, but even fighters had their limits. The battle for survival had taken its toll, and Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead. "You all know why we're here," Jason said, his voice steady despite the fatigue that had begun to settle deep in his bones. The recent attacks were more than just attempts to disrupt our operations. They were designed to break us, and make no mistake, we are broken. We've lost key assets, our reputation has been tarnished, and we've been left scrambling to pick up the pieces. He paused, letting the words settle. The truth hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood. The IEP was reeling, its former strength now a mere shadow of what it once was. But they weren't done yet. Jason refused to let them be. Alana, who had spent the last several days tirelessly working to stabilize their systems, spoke up. "We're still standing, Jason. We've managed to contain most of the damage to our infrastructure. The cyber attack was extensive, but we're patching the gaps. We've got a few things left to leverage, but the bigger challenge is rebuilding the trust of our allies." Jason looked over at her, acknowledging her efforts. "And how long will that take?" Alana bit her lip, a sign of frustration. "It's not just about time. It's about proving to them that we can still deliver. Some of our partners are already looking elsewhere. They think we're too damaged, too vulnerable. Then we make them see otherwise," Jason said with certainty. "I'm not ready to give up on the IEP, and neither should any of you. If we want to come out of this, we need to make bold moves, and we need to show the world that we're capable of much more than just surviving." Sean, who had been studying a series of encrypted messages from their intelligence network, lifted his head. "You're right, but we need to know who we're up against before we take the next step. We don't just need allies, we need to know who's still willing to stand with us. And there are a lot of unknowns right now." Jason nodded. "I've seen the reports. Our enemies are growing bolder, and they've got resources, but we've got one thing they don't: each other. The breaking point." As the meeting continued, the enormity of their situation began to settle in. Jason could feel the weight of their collective burden. The damage wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The team had endured losses that would have shattered lesser organizations. Yet they had held on. But how long could they keep up this fight? Alana's exhaustion was starting to show, her face drawn and pale, eyes tired from long hours at the helm of their digital recovery efforts. She'd been working on the front lines of their cyber defense. But even the most advanced systems couldn't protect them from the larger political and corporate warfare they were now facing. Sean, on the other hand, had been in the field, coordinating with a small group of trusted agents to track down rogue operatives and uncover the true masterminds behind the attack. His face was hard, but Jason could see the strain in his shoulders. Every mission had become more dangerous, and every lead had brought them closer to those responsible. But the deeper they dug, the more complicated things became. Jason knew they needed more than just a plan. They needed to reassert themselves, to show the world that despite everything, they had not only survived, they were ready to fight back, rebuilding the trust. Jason's next move was clear. They needed to rebuild the bridges that had been burned during the chaos. This wasn't just about repairing their internal operations. It was about reaching out to those who had once been their allies and proving they were still a force to be reckoned with. The world was watching. The question wasn't whether they could survive, it was whether they had the strength to rise from the ashes. "I'll reach out to the key players," Jason said, turning to face the team. "We'll start with those who are still on our side. We can't afford to wait any longer. We need to prove that we're in control, that we've adapted, and that we're stronger than ever." Alana nodded in agreement, though her brow furrowed with concern. "You're right, but we can't just rely on our old allies. We need to expand our reach, new partnerships, new alliances. We need to make sure we're not walking into a trap. We'll need intelligence, and we'll need it fast." Jason looked at her, his expression determined. "You get us the intel, we'll handle the rest. The cost of victory." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jason worked closely with Alana to track down potential allies, while Sean and his team continued their investigations into the source of the attacks. They were now operating in the shadows, moving swiftly but cautiously, aware that they were being watched at every turn. It was a race against time. Each step forward came at a cost. They burned through resources, made promises they weren't sure they could keep, and put themselves at greater risk with every move they made. But there was no turning back. Every day that passed without action meant they were giving their enemies more time to regroup and plot their next move. Jason found himself questioning the cost of survival. How much were they willing to sacrifice to stay alive? Was the price worth it? The moment of reckoning. The tipping point came in the form of a cryptic message intercepted by Alana's team. It was a communication from one of their former allies, someone who had once been loyal to the IEP but had since turned against them. The message was clear. There was an impending strike, one that could cripple what little they had left. Jason's mind raced as he read the message. The strike was planned for within the next 24 hours, and the forces behind it were not just targeting the IEP, they were targeting the foundations of everything they had worked to build. It wasn't just a matter of survival now. It was a matter of proving they could weather this storm and come out on top. He turned to his team. "We need to move, and we need to move fast. This is our moment to either reclaim everything we've lost or watch it all burn to the ground." Alana met his gaze, her eyes cold with resolve. "We've been preparing for this. It's time to fight back." The final push. The next 24 hours felt like an eternity. Every moment was a race against the clock. Jason and Alana worked tirelessly to fortify their digital defenses, while Sean's team prepared to strike at the heart of their enemy's operations. The stage was set for one final push. As the countdown to the attack began, Jason stood once again at the head of the command room. The faces of his team were tired but determined, each one ready to give everything they had to ensure the IEP's survival. They were all in this together, and they had one last chance to prove that they were not just survivors, they were fighters. "We're going to show them what we're made of," Jason said, his voice steady but filled with unwavering conviction. "Tonight, we take back what's ours, and we do it together." The team nodded in unison, the resolve in their eyes matching his own. The battle was far from over, but this was their fight, and they were ready. Chapter 11, The Storm Unleashed. The night air was thick with tension, every second slipping away like grains of sand in an hourglass. Jason and his team had made their final preparations. The attack was imminent, but they had one thing their enemies didn't: unity. As the clock ticked down to zero, there was a quiet certainty in the command room. Every person in the room knew what was at stake, not just their survival, but the legacy of everything they had built. Alana's fingers flew over the keyboard, sending a flurry of commands into the IEP's network. She had spent days reinforcing their digital defenses, shoring up weaknesses, and re-establishing the barriers that had been breached during the initial attacks. Now, as they braced for the assault, she was ready for the inevitable digital onslaught. "Firewall is holding," she said with a strained but hopeful voice. "But it won't last long. They're relentless." Jason nodded, his eyes scanning the room. Sean and his team had already deployed on the ground, coordinating with local assets and making their way to key infrastructure points. Every operative knew their role, their target. The last phase of their plan had been set in motion. But even as he issued orders and looked to his team for updates, a thought gnawed at him. He had led them this far, but was it enough? Were they prepared for the weight of the coming storm? The attack begins. The first wave hit at precisely 2 a.m., a coordinated assault designed to cripple their systems. Alana's monitors blinked red as the cyber attack flooded in. The enemy was using multiple points of entry, seemingly impossible to track. But they had prepared for this. The encrypted signals began pouring in, like a tidal wave threatening to drown their operations. Incoming breach in Sector Alpha, Alana announced as her fingers danced over the keys, trying to reroute the incoming data. Jason's voice was calm despite the urgency in the air. Isolate them. Do not let them spread. Working on it, she replied, barely audible over the rising noise of the incoming data storm. Meanwhile, on the ground, Sean's team was engaging with enemy operatives, tracking them through the shadows. The enemy had anticipated their movements, however, and an ambush lay in wait. We've got eyes on the target, but it's a trap, Sean reported, his voice cool but tense. We need backup now. Jason's heart raced. This was the moment they had been preparing for. If they were going to survive, they needed to strike first. Sean, fall back and regroup at Extraction Point Delta. Alana, do we have access to their comms? I'm rerouting their signals now, Alana replied, her voice focused but strained. I'll send a jamming signal to blind them. Buy us some time. Do it, Jason ordered. The shift in power. The attack was relentless. The enemy had resources they hadn't anticipated. Trained soldiers, advanced technology, and an unwavering determination to take down the IEP. But despite the odds stacked against them, Jason could see the moment shift. They were on the defensive, yes, but they had an advantage. They had the element of surprise. Alana's expertise in digital warfare gave them a vital edge. Her knowledge of the enemy's tactics allowed them to manipulate their own systems to slow the attack down. Jason's role was to command and lead, keeping the morale of his team high and making sure everyone knew exactly what was at stake. But even as they fought back, the cost was becoming increasingly apparent. Resources were dwindling, and time was running out. Jason, Sean's voice crackled through the comms. We need those coordinates. The enemy's closing in. Jason's mind raced. He scanned the room, checking with each of his team members. There was no time to hesitate. I'm sending you the backup coordinates now. Hold your ground. Sean's voice came through, quieter this time. Understood. Moving out. The sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed in the background. Jason clenched his fists. His mind was a whirl of commands, quick decisions, and an overwhelming sense of urgency. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet he couldn't afford to lose faith. Not now. A critical moment. As the hours dragged on, the tension reached a breaking point. They were nearing the end of the enemy's initial assault, but there was still one final, devastating strike to come. The enemy's cyber specialists were working their way through the last defenses, and Sean's team was cornered, fighting for their lives. Jason had one final card to play, but it wasn't without risk. If they executed the counterattack and failed, the IEP would crumble. There would be no rebuilding. It would all be over. Turning to Alana, he asked, how much longer before you can take control of their comms? She didn't look up from her screen. Give me 10 more minutes. If I can access their central hub, I'll be able to disrupt their entire system. We'll have the upper hand. Jason nodded. He didn't have 10 minutes, but he had no choice. We'll buy you that time. He turned to the rest of the team. This is it. We fight for every second. We don't let them push us back. We fight until they know we're not going down without a fight. The final push. The battle reached its climax as the enemy launched their final wave. Jason's heart hammered in his chest as his team mobilized. Every agent, every soldier, and every technician were now a part of this fight, not just to survive, but to prove that they were capable of withstanding anything. Alana's fingers flew across the keyboard, each keystroke a lifeline to their survival. I've got it, she said. I've gained access to their core network, jamming their signals now. The system went dark for a moment as the enemy's communications began to fracture. They were no longer able to coordinate, their plans thrown into chaos. It was the opening Jason had been waiting for. Go, he shouted. Sean's team, having fought their way through a brutal battle, made their move, forcing the enemy into a retreat. The tides of the battle had turned, but the fight was far from over. They had gained a small victory, but it was enough to tip the scales in their favor. A new dawn. As the dust began to settle, Jason and his team gathered once more in the command room. Exhausted but triumphant, they exchanged weary glances. They had survived the storm, but the cost was undeniable. The physical toll, the mental strain, the losses, they had given everything. But in the end, they had done it. The IEP had weathered the storm, and they had proved to their enemies that they were not to be underestimated. Jason took a long breath, looking over the room at his team. We've got a long road ahead of us, but we're not done yet. We've faced the worst and we've come out on top. Now it's time to rebuild. And we will. Stronger than before. Chapter 12. The Calm After the Storm. The sound of distant explosions and the crackling of comms slowly faded as the first light of dawn crept through the shattered windows of the IEP's command room. Outside, the chaos of the previous night seemed to give way to an eerie stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The battle was far from over, but the storm that had raged through the earth, fueled by deception, violence, and fear, was finally beginning to settle. And against all odds, the IEP crew had become the key to humanity's survival. Jason stood by the window gazing out over the landscape. The sky was a washed-out gray, the air heavy with the aftermath of war. But the silence spoke volumes. For the first time in years, there was hope. "Do you think it's over?" Alana's voice came from behind him, breaking the quiet. Jason turned, his expression thoughtful. "No, not yet. But we've stopped the bleeding. For now, the final push." As the enemy forces scrambled to regain their footing, the IEP crew had become the wild card no one had anticipated. Alana's swift command over the cyber battlefield had dismantled the enemy's communication networks, throwing them into disarray. Sean and his team had executed precise strikes, disrupting the enemy's ground operations. And with every passing hour, their efforts gave the rest of humanity the chance to regroup and push back. In the war rooms of the remaining human strongholds, the IEP crew's tactics had become the talk of the world. They had taken a losing fight and turned it into a rallying cry for every nation still standing. The whispers of their success began to spread like wildfire, igniting a spark of rebellion in those who had been on the brink of surrender. But even as victory seemed within reach, Jason knew that the cost had been immense. They had not only fought a battle against enemy forces, but against the disillusionment that had threatened to consume humanity. They were not just defending territory or cities. They were fighting for a future, for the idea that humanity could overcome its darkest hour. "Jason," Alana continued, her voice tinged with exhaustion, but still sharp, "the enemy is pulling back. They're disorganized. We've won the digital battlefield." Jason nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's our opening. We need to press now, while they're vulnerable. No second chances." A shift in power. The IEP crew's final blow came when they successfully infiltrated the last of the enemy's command centers. They had anticipated every move, countering the enemy's every attempt to regain control. The strategy had been risky, but it was effective. With the enemy's final command structure broken, there was nothing left to hold them together. "We've got them," Sean reported over the comms, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. "They're done. Their forces are retreating." Jason's heart raced. For the first time in days, there was a flicker of something that had been absent from his life for too long. Peace. It wasn't just the enemy's defeat. It was the realization that they had managed to do what seemed impossible. They had united humanity in the face of extinction. "Bring the team in," Jason said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything they had accomplished. "It's time to finish this, rebuilding a world." In the days that followed the last battle, the IEP crew became more than just a group of elite operatives. They became the architects of a new beginning. The world that had once been divided by conflict, greed, and power struggles now had a chance to heal, thanks to their sacrifices, their leadership, and their unyielding determination. Jason, Alana, Sean, and the rest of the team had not just stopped a war. They had inspired a generation to rebuild, to hope again. They worked tirelessly, coordinating with international leaders, scientists, and engineers to restore the world to a semblance of peace. Infrastructure was rebuilt. Cities rose from the ashes. Technology was shared among nations, and trust began to grow once more. But it wasn't just about the physical rebuilding. It was about mending the fractured spirit of humanity. Through their example, people began to remember what it meant to be united, to stand together in the face of adversity. The new dawn. Jason stood on the rooftop of the IEP's headquarters, watching as the sun began to rise over the horizon. The scars of war were still visible on the landscape below, but there was a renewed sense of purpose in the air. The world was changing, and the people were determined to make sure it never returned to what it had been. Alana joined him on the rooftop, her eyes scanning the city below. It's strange, isn't it? How quickly things can change. One moment, we're on the brink of destruction. The next, we're standing in the light of a new day. Jason smiled, the weight of their journey finally settling on his shoulders. We didn't just survive, Alana. We made sure that humanity had the chance to thrive again. For a moment, they stood together, silent, as the world around them began to stir with the hope of a new beginning. The Ape crew had faced the storm, and they had emerged as the calm after it. Chapter 13. The Earth's Forgiveness. It wasn't just the people who had to rebuild the world. It was the Earth too. In the weeks after the last battle, the IEP team found themselves coordinating efforts not just to restore the broken infrastructure, but to heal the very planet that had been torn apart by greed and neglect. The Earth's response to humanity's actions had been swift and merciless, but as the global community began to unite under a single banner of cooperation, something incredible began to happen. The Earth started to relent. Jason stood in the command center of IEP headquarters, eyes glued to the monitors that displayed seismic activity, climate data, and environmental readings. For the first time in months, the screens no longer blared red alerts or flashing warnings. There was calm. Alana stepped up beside him, looking at the same screens. It's happening. The patterns are changing. Jason nodded, not quite ready to believe it. After everything they'd been through, after the apocalyptic storms and the relentless cycle of disasters, seeing the data shift so suddenly felt surreal. I told you, Jason said, his voice almost a whisper. The Earth didn't want to destroy us. It wanted us to change. And maybe, just maybe, it's starting to forgive us. Rewilding efforts begin. The rewilding projects, which had once been just a theoretical part of Operation Rebirth, were now in full swing. Areas once destroyed by fires, floods, and hurricanes were beginning to show signs of recovery. Forests, once reduced to stumps and ash, were slowly starting to regrow. Rivers that had been polluted and choked by human activity were clearing. And in some areas, the wildlife that had fled in the face of human encroachment was slowly returning. Daniel, who had been spearheading the environmental recovery efforts, looked out over the reforestation zones with a mix of awe and disbelief. He had seen firsthand the devastation caused by decades of exploitation. But now, as he walked through the newly planted groves, he could see the first signs of life. The tiny shoots of young trees, the rustling of birds in the distance. We're really doing it, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Stephen, standing beside him, nodded. The Earth's giving us a second chance at Daniel. We just need to make sure we don't blow it. The push for global cooperation. Back at IEP headquarters, Jason had become something of a global symbol. Not just for his leadership during the war, but for the vision of unity and cooperation he had championed. He had worked tirelessly to broker peace between nations, pushing for global resource-sharing agreements and economic models that prioritize sustainability over profit. It wasn't easy. There were still countries resistant to the idea of working together, countries that clung to old ways and were wary of the shifts in power. But slowly the tide was turning. As the planet began to show signs of healing, the world's leaders had no choice but to acknowledge that the new way forward was the only path left. One evening, Jason stood before a New World Assembly. Leaders from every continent gathered for the first time in history in a truly united effort to save the planet. We've seen the results, Jason said, his voice echoing through the large chamber. The Earth is responding to our efforts, to our commitment to change. This is not just a momentary fix. It's a chance to ensure the survival of every living thing on this planet, human, animal, and plant. The assembly was quiet, the weight of his words settling over the room. After years of conflict, the idea of true global cooperation was still difficult for some to accept. But even the skeptics could see the truth in Jason's words. "We have the chance to make something new," Jason continued. "A world that doesn't just survive but thrives. A world where the Earth and humanity are no longer at war. The Earth has given us the chance to make this right. But we have to act, and we have to act now." The Earth's quiet response. Back in the field, the Earth seemed to respond to the global shift. Natural disasters, once so frequent and violent, had lessened. While there were still storms and earthquakes, they were no longer the apocalyptic forces they had once been. In place of devastation, there was a strange quiet, a kind of serenity that had not been felt in years. Alana, who had become the chief liaison between the IEP and global tech companies, smiled as she reviewed the data that showed a marked decline in weather extremes. The hurricanes that had once been monstrous and unstoppable were weakening, their power dissipating before they could wreak havoc. Earthquakes were no longer triggered by human interference. And in places like the Amazon, deforestation had reversed, and the forests were beginning to heal themselves. "It's like the planet's healing as we do," Alana said, staring at a map that showed increasing biodiversity in newly protected areas. "It's a start," Jason replied, "but we're only part of the equation. The Earth is still vulnerable. We need to keep this up, forever. A new era of harmony." In the years that followed, the Earth and humanity entered a fragile but promising era of balance. Cities that had once sprawled across once forested land were now nestled in harmony with their environments, designed to work with nature rather than against it. Renewable energy had become the global standard, and the heavy industries that had once been the source of so much harm were now relics of the past. Jason stood on the balcony of his new home, overlooking a world that was beginning to heal. The scars of the past were still there, but they were being erased, slowly but surely. Humanity had learned its lesson, and the Earth had too. "Do you think we've earned it?" Alana asked, standing beside him. Jason thought for a moment, watching as the first signs of a new dawn broke over the horizon. "I think we're on the right path," he said, "but the real test is whether we can stay on it. A future unwritten." The Earth had forgiven humanity, not because it had to, but because humanity had chosen to change. The IEP team had become the architects of that change, guiding humanity through a crisis of unprecedented scale. And in doing so, they had helped the world learn how to live with the planet, not against it. As the sun rose over the newly reclaimed forests and cities, it became clear. The battle between Earth and humanity was over. And though the scars of the past would always remain, the future was now unwritten. And it was in the hands of those who chose to protect the world, not destroy it. For the first time in generations, humanity had earned its place in the world, not as conquerors, but as stewards of the Earth. Chapter 14. A New Dawn. The world had turned a corner, and the scars of the past, though not forgotten, were slowly becoming a part of history. The battle between Earth and humanity, once fierce and unrelenting, had found its end not through the force of weapons or the might of armies, but through understanding, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to change. The IEP crew, the architects of this new world, stood at the forefront of a global movement that had redefined the very essence of survival. Together they had united the fractured pieces of society, restoring balance between humanity and the Earth. And though the work was far from over, a sense of hope lingered in the air, something that had been missing for far too long. Jason's reflection. Jason stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking a valley that had once been devastated by floods and wildfires. Now it was a thriving ecosystem, with lush greenery stretching as far as the eye could see. The rivers, once choked with debris and pollutants, now flowed clear and pure. The sky above, once choked with smoke, was bright and blue, untouched by the storms that had once ravaged the land. It was a different world, a world that had been rebuilt from the brink of destruction. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "We did it," he whispered, almost as if to confirm the reality of it all. For years, he had been on the front lines of conflict, pushing for solutions and fighting against the elements. But now, in this moment, he felt the weight of it lift. Beside him, Alana stood quietly, her gaze fixed on the same view. "We did it together," she said softly, her hand resting gently on his arm. Jason nodded. "Yes, together." Alana's legacy. Alana had always known that leadership wasn't just about making the tough decisions. It was about uniting people under a common cause. In the aftermath of the war, she had become the bridge between the different factions of society, pushing for peace and healing. It was her vision of a world that embraced sustainability, respect for nature, and global cooperation that had helped shift the course of history. Now, as she looked at the thriving world around her, she realized that their efforts had sparked something much bigger than just survival. They had created a world where humanity could thrive alongside the Earth rather than at its expense. "Do you think we'll ever be fully forgiven?" Jason asked, his voice thoughtful. Alana smiled. "I think it's not about forgiveness, Jason. It's about moving forward. We've learned our lesson. We just have to keep learning." Daniel's reflection. Daniel stood in the heart of one of the newly revitalized forests, the smell of fresh pine filling the air. As one of the lead architects of the environmental recovery efforts, he had watched the world transform from a place of devastation to a flourishing ecosystem. The Earth, which had once been on the brink of collapse, was now a testament to the resilience of nature and of humanity. "The Earth doesn't hold grudges," Daniel murmured to himself, watching a small family of deer graze nearby. "It just wants us to learn." He had spent countless hours replanting trees, restoring habitats, and ensuring that humanity's impact on the environment would never again reach the catastrophic levels of the past. And now, as he observed the young wildlife that had returned to these once scarred lands, he knew the Earth was healing. It was a quiet healing, not driven by the urgency of war, but by the slow, steady rhythm of life returning to where it had once been lost. A new chapter for humanity. The world was not perfect, nor would it ever be, but it was better than it had been in a long time. Governments worked together to protect the environment. The global economy has shifted toward sustainability. Resources were shared equitably, and recent technologies, clean and green, redefined industry. The IEP crew, though scattered across the world in their respective roles, remained a close-knit team, forever bound by the trials they had faced and the victories they had won. They had seen the Earth at its breaking point and helped pull it back from the edge. And in doing so, they had rewritten humanity's future. Their journey had taught them that survival was not just about fighting the battles before them, it was about understanding the consequences of their actions and working toward a world that respected the balance of nature. Jason's closing words. Sitting once again in the headquarters that had been their home during the darkest days of the war, Jason thought back to everything they had overcome. The loss, the sacrifice, the constant fight for survival, but also the moments of triumph, the friendships forged in the fires of adversity, and the realization that they were never truly alone. Humanity, with all its flaws, had risen to the occasion, and the Earth, ever resilient, had offered its forgiveness. Not because it had to, but because it knew humanity had the capacity for change. As Jason looked out over the skyline, where green rooftops intertwined with the steel and glass of the city, he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. A new world had been born from the ashes of the old, and it was up to those who had fought to rebuild it to ensure it thrived. "The future is ours," Jason said, his voice full of hope, "and this time we'll protect it." Epilogue, a legacy for the future. The world moved forward, no longer at war with itself or the planet. The Earth had forgiven, but humanity had learned. They had built something better, a society that valued balance, sustainability, and harmony with nature. And as the generations that followed grew up in this new world, they did so with the knowledge that their survival depended not on conquering the Earth, but on living with it. And as the IEP crew faded into history, their names etched in the chronicles of this new era, the legacy they left behind was simple. they had shown humanity how to survive, not by dominating the Earth, but by respecting it. What humanity learned. The war between humanity and the Earth was never truly a war of weapons or armies. It was a conflict of choices, a clash between short-term gain and long-term survival, a reckoning for a species that had taken too much without understanding the consequences. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the world began to heal, humanity was left to reflect on the lessons it had learned, lessons that would shape the future for generations to come. 1. The fragility of life and the Earth's limits. For centuries, humans had built societies based on the assumption that nature was limitless. The Earth was seen as an abundant resource to be exploited, its oceans, forests, and air as boundless as the ambitions of humanity. But when the Earth began to retaliate, when the natural systems that once seemed so resilient began to buckle under the weight of human activity, humanity learned the hard truth. The planet had limits. The Earth was not an infinite resource, and it was not a passive observer. It was a living, breathing entity with its own cycles and rhythms that, if disrupted for too long, could push it into a state of collapse. The destruction of ecosystems, the warming of the planet, the poisoning of air and water, these were all signs that humanity had pushed the Earth too far. Through disaster and desperation, humanity learned the importance of living within the Earth's limits. They understood that true progress did not lie in domination, but in stewardship. It was a humbling realization, one that shifted the paradigm from extraction to care. In the end, the Earth was the ultimate teacher, showing humanity that life was fragile and that survival required respect for the delicate balance of nature. 2. The power of unity and global cooperation. In the face of the Earth's wrath, humanity's survival depended not on individual nations or corporations, but on global cooperation. The divisions that had once separated people, political, economic, cultural, were rendered meaningless in the face of a planet fighting back. It became clear that the survival of humanity could no longer be a matter of national self-interest. The IEP's bold vision of Operation Rebirth was only possible because people across the world were willing to set aside their differences and unite for the greater good. Nations once locked in endless conflicts now work together to create sanctuaries for the Earth, to share resources, and to implement policies that respected the environment. The global economy had to be restructured, and the world's wealth had to be redistributed to ensure that no one was left behind. This cooperative spirit did not come easily. There were countless obstacles and deep resistance, but the people who had fought for survival understood the stakes, and they chose collaboration over division. The war against the Earth had shown them that true strength came not from isolation, but from unity. 3. The cost of convenience. Perhaps one of the most painful lessons learned was the full cost of convenience. For generations, humanity had built its way of life around consumption, instant gratification, and cheap resources. Fossil fuels powered economies. Deforestation cleared land for development, and industrial agriculture provided food at an unprecedented scale. But this model came at a cost, the cost of depleted resources, destroyed habitats, and poisoned ecosystems. It wasn't until the disasters ravaged the planet, until the rivers ran dry and the air grew toxic, that humanity realized how fragile their way of life truly was. The Earth's retaliation made it clear that their lifestyle, once taken for granted, was unsustainable. Rebuilding after the war meant reevaluating every aspect of human life, from the way cities were designed to the foods they ate, to the very systems of energy and transportation that powered their economies. It was no longer acceptable to live in a way that harmed the planet. Convenience, it turned out, was an illusion. True progress required sacrifice and a commitment to sustainability. Humanity learned that they could no longer afford to live as if the Earth was an inexhaustible resource. 4. The importance of long-term thinking. Before the war, humanity had largely operated with a short-term mindset, seeking quick fixes to immediate problems, driven by political cycles, profit margins, and consumer demands. But the Earth's response forced humanity to think beyond the present, to focus on the long-term health of the planet and future generations. The concept of tomorrow was no longer abstract. It was something to be fought for, something that demanded careful planning and foresight. The rebuilding efforts that followed Operation Rebirth were not just about restoring the planet, but about ensuring that humanity's relationship with the Earth would be one of balance and mutual respect for generations to come. The IEP's work emphasized sustainability, long-term environmental stewardship, and the need for innovation in fields such as renewable energy, agriculture, and waste management. Humanity had learned that without long-term thinking, their survival was not guaranteed. The Earth would continue to fight back, and only those who could adapt would thrive. 5. The resilience of nature and humanity. Though the Earth had been pushed to its breaking point, and many species had been lost, the war also revealed the resilience of nature. The planet, in its infinite complexity, had a remarkable ability to heal itself when given the chance. Forests regrew, rivers ran clear again, and ecosystems slowly began to return to balance. The animals that had fled in the face of human destruction returned to the newly protected lands, and species thought extinct began to reemerge. This was a lesson in humility. It showed humanity that, no matter how much damage had been done, the Earth had the capacity to recover if given the right conditions. The same could be said of humanity. After all, it was the human spirit that had driven the change. It was their resilience, working together, sacrificing their comforts, and rebuilding from the ground up that had ensured survival. The war between humanity and the Earth had not been a final confrontation, but a turning point, a moment where humanity had to decide whether they would be a part of the planet's future or its destruction. The decision to change, to adapt, was a testament to humanity's resilience. 6. The need for humility and respect. Finally, perhaps the most profound lesson humanity learned was the importance of humility. For centuries, human civilization had existed in a state of dominance over nature, driven by the belief that they were masters of the Earth. But the war, in all its fury, had shattered that illusion. The Earth had reminded them, in the most brutal way possible, that they were not separate from nature. They were a part of it. In the aftermath of the war, humanity's relationship with the Earth was redefined. It was no longer a relationship of conqueror and conquered, but of partnership and respect. Humans were stewards, caretakers of a planet that was as fragile as it was resilient. They learned that survival required reverence for the Earth's processes, its cycles, and its life. It was a lesson that would guide them for generations. The scars of the past would never be fully erased, but humanity could move forward with a deep understanding that their fate was intricately linked to the health of the planet. Conclusion: a legacy of change. The war had been devastating, but it had also been the catalyst for humanity's greatest transformation. It had forced them to confront their own destructive tendencies, to reimagine their future, and to take responsibility for the world they had created. And while the lessons were painful, they were the key to ensuring that humanity would never again make the same mistakes. In the years to come, as humanity thrived in harmony with the Earth, the lessons learned from the war would be passed down through generations. They would remember the cost of survival, the importance of unity, and the need for humility. They would build a future where the Earth was not something to be feared, but something to be respected and protected. And in that future, humanity would find not only survival, but true prosperity.
Other books by J.B. Crow. Scan the QR code to go to the author's page.